The Galactic Empire at first glance appears to be a well-oiled machine united in their goal to conquer the galaxy. However, as we've discussed numerous times, this was rarely the case, with Imperial higher-ups constantly jockeying for power. However, there was another considerable split between the Army and the Navy, two forces that were expected to work largely in tandem. However, this was not the case. Now, when we talk about the Army and the Navy, we need to understand that they are considerably codependent. The Army required the Navy for support and travel, and the Navy needed the manpower for operations such as making arrests and holding territory that only the Army could provide. However, this is largely where their positive relationship starts and ends. The Empire's Navy and Army was very different. Generally speaking, the Navy was by far the more prestigious position than any in the Army. As we saw after Han Solo was kicked out of the Navy, he was assigned to Mimban in the Army to die in the mud. As a sweeping generalization, it comes down to the very character of the Imperial Academy. Students who showed to be academic or perceptive, and to show some level of free thinking and adaptability, they would generally be pushed towards a career in the Navy. However, the vast majority, who were perhaps more physically than mentally capable, were pushed towards the Army and Stormtrooper Corps. The cultures of these different organisations could not be much more different. The Army appraised strength and conformity above all else, meanwhile the Navy pushed for more tactical thinking. This is probably because the Navy had considerably more responsibility. At the end of the day, one rogue engineer aboard a Star Destroyer could cause massive amounts of damage, compared to say just a dim-witted stormtrooper who's guarding some town in the middle of nowhere in the Outer Rim. Now, not only are these two very different cultures, but they also completely clash a lot. The Army a lot of the time will have seen the Navy as stuck-up and overprivileged wimps. And you have to admit, they do have a point. Compare the sterile environment of a Star Destroyer deck to, say, a posting on Tatooine. Not only this, but the Navy received considerably more funding than the Army did, and were often the centre of Imperial propaganda and celebrations. The Empire truly did prize above all else its Navy. Meanwhilst, the Navy crew likely saw stormtroopers as uneducated, dirty thugs, and brutal compared to them, unintelligent, as thousands of stormtroopers were thrown against enemy lines to be butchered. They were very much seen as maybe even a meat shield. Meanwhilst, when you're in the Navy, you have very real shields, and you're pretty protected most of the time. So that's probably a very good basis for the rift between the two groups. We also need to consider high-ranking members of both groups were also at odds. In my opinion, this actually comes down mostly to the Clone Wars. Generally, majority of generals in the Clone Wars were Jedi, meanwhilst admirals and Navy leaders were primarily humans. As we know, the Jedi were killed, but many of the human admirals and Navy staff stayed on with the Empire post the Clone Wars. The Navy leaders were very much the old guard, if you will, and they'd spent years in high-ranking positions and had accumulated huge amounts of power and wealth, unlike the Army, which, in comparison, had very few opportunities. And in fact, it was kind of new. Remember, when the Empire took power, clones were the ones who did most of the fighting, and it didn't get phased out immediately, so the Army was pretty much the new kid on the block, if you will. Finally, consider how generally the Navy grooms its leaders for political power, for example, positions as Moffs. This is not only because they have often considerably higher intellect than, say, ground soldiers, but being in the Navy, they're responsible for huge amounts of assets and materials. For this reason, it's very easy for Navy leaders to gain power. They can exploit others very easily. For example, refusing to allow a certain company's vessels through a blockade. It gives them complete power over them, and it might buy them goodwill with a company's competitor. Now, the Army didn't really have this capability. Sure, you could set up a roadblock and, shake down some people, but they weren't able to do it where they could generally cause a disturbance on a galactic scale. And the final reason for the bad blood between the Navy and Army likely lays in the cross of ideologies. The Army was unquestionably loyal to Palpatine. and the Empire, they bled fanatically across the galaxy on numerous battlefields for Palpatine's ideals. However, the Navy less so. The Navy was taught to think critically, and many in it could see the flaws in the Empire, for example spending too much on a super battle station that was destroyed. And there was numerous other projects that they wanted resources to go towards. One example, Thrawn's TIE Defender program. I can guarantee you there's a lot of people in the Navy who would have rather had better fighters than this super Death Star. Ultimately, I think it's clear that the army was in many ways a hammer, incredibly effective, but had very little concept of the bigger picture. Meanwhile, the Navy was maybe all too aware of the scene playing out before it, and these two radically different viewpoints put them at odds, naturally. But whose side are you on, the army or the navy? And which is the deadlier force? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, I really do hope you enjoyed. If so, please remember to like, share and sub, as it's really appreciated and it helps the channel grow. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at TheLoreGuy and tick the bell for regular updates. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching, I really do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.